Good morning and welcome to the Joint Administrative Rules and Regs today. We're glad everybody's here. I think we actually have a quorum. That's pretty good. It's not going to be a very long meeting today. So let me see here. Why don't we go ahead and get started unless somebody needs to wait. And we'll start with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. Welcome to committee. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chair. May it please the committee. My name is Curtis Wyatt, and I'm the Chief Counsel of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. We have one regulation before you today. It is 115-25-14. This is one of our exempt regs that sets our fishing creel limits. It's a regulation that's updated pretty regularly based on updated scientific data by our fisheries department. I submitted testimony yesterday. I hope you all received it. They're summarizing in the letter the basic changes there. It shortens the trout season from November 1 through April 15th to December 1 to March 31st. It also, in large part, liberalizes the blue catfish restrictions in this state, allowing anglers to harvest more and more blue cats. The reason for that is that our scientists have found that after a number of years restricting the take on blue cats, they've reached a population where they can self-reproduce, and we actually don't need to restock them anymore across our state. So we're opening up an opportunity for anglers to keep blue catfish, which are from my personal experience, a very popular sport fish in this state. And then I have some water body specific regulations there, but I won't dive into them. Does the committee have any questions for me?
Committee, do you have any questions? Okay, we're going to start with Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. What's the reason for shortening the trout season? Maybe I just didn't hear you say that.
Yeah.
Being shortened.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I meant to cover that. So the trout season being shortened is that the primary purpose there is that the rising costs, our trout program is seeing a massive increase in costs because unlike our neighboring states like Colorado, which have obviously reproducing populations, in Missouri where they have several trout hatcheries, we have to buy every trout that comes into the state of Kansas. And from what I understand, talking to our fisheries people, our suppliers, the cost of trout is skyrocketing, and that's primarily because they're receiving skyrocketing costs of feed to feed the trout. So each trout costs more and more. And so we're shortening. We did creel surveys with our trout anglers, and they indicated they were okay with this change. We're shortening the season and not stocking as many trout to combat costs.
You talk to the various stakeholders who this would be impacting?
Yes, the stakeholders primarily here are our trout anglers, and we do that through our regular creel survey. So yes, they were consulted with this.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of areas of concern. Following up on Senator Warren's question, you told us that you maintain contact with stakeholders regarding these changes through your annual creel survey. Did I understand that correctly?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. Did the annual creel survey say, do you think it's a good idea that we limit, for example, blue cats with only one fish greater than 30 inches? I mean, I think I've seen the creel survey. I don't think it's that specific about what stakeholders think about proposed regulations that weren't even proposed at the time the creel survey was conducted. Help me understand that.
Yeah, I've Assistant Fisheries Director here who can maybe speak more to the specifics.
With the chair's permission, that'd be great.
Okay, would you like to speak, sir, answer that?
Sorry, please introduce yourself when you get up here. Thank you. Welcome to committee.
Thank you for having me. My name's John Ranke, and I'm one of the assistant directors of the Fisheries Division. Our creel surveys, they're kind of roving, so we do try and hit all the lakes within a 5-year span or so. The creel survey for the trout was specific to trout anglers during our trout season. Our blue catfish angler surveys happened just randomly if there's blue catfish at a reservoir. But we did have a special catfish section. Every 5 years or so, we try to do a licensed angler survey. And our previous, not our most recent one, but the survey before that showed that we asked specifically about catfish regulations, and our anglers were in favor of having more restrictive regulations on the larger fish if that would help protect the spawning and the spawning potential in our reservoirs so that we wouldn't have to stock them anymore.
Help me understand the creel survey. By the way, creel, that's a reference to, I think, the bag or whatever that you carry your fish
The old
in.
basket,
Your
yep.
the basket is the creel, the stringer is the stringer. But the creel survey, is this some sort of a written survey, and is it handed out at the marina? Is it sent out to everyone with a license? How does that work?
Okay, the creel surveys that we do annually at different impoundments, those we actually have most seasonal employees that have a specific set of questions that we ask the anglers. We don't ask every angler. There's a scientific method to get that information as far as how many anglers are fishing, that sort of thing. So it's a one-on-one interview that happens while the anglers are fishing at that particular body of water.
The only one-on-one interviews I ever get at a state park is from the game warden, asking me what those empty cans of beer are in the back of the boat. I thank you. I do have an additional question, Madam Chair, with your leave.
Sure.
Okay. I don't know which one of you is best to help me with this, but it's a matter of grave concern to me, being from Sedgwick County and my constituents being from Sedgwick County and fishing at Cheney Lake, that you're reducing the creel limit for crappie from 50 to 20. That's a big deal. Why is that happening? What are the counts at Cheney? What's changed so dramatically that we're reducing the creel limit?
That was due to a specific creel survey at Cheney where we asked those anglers about crappie specifically, what they preferred, because we were hearing a lot of feedback from our anglers. So that was result come specifically from creel surveys interviewing anglers at Cheney. And
So
I believe that would have been in the 2020, I can get that information, but I believe it was the 2023 angling year when that particular creel
So it's
survey
not
was done.
because there's been a change in fish populations at Cheney, it's just because the people you happen to run into in 2020 or 2023, that you found some people who they really did say that they wanted to lower the limits at Cheney Lake on crappie?
Yes.
And so it's not based on fish surveys, I mean, counting the fish, the scientific stuff that you usually use to set limits and seasons. It's based on just some people that you found at the marina one day that said we want the limits lowered on crappie?
Well, it was throughout the whole creel survey period when we creel March through October. And we do this all around the lake, not at any one specific location all year.
Okay, well, I don't want to belabor this, but I thought limits were based upon experts at the department calculating how many fish there are and how those fish need to be, how many you can take at a time and what the limits are, et cetera. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
This is, the change that you're referring to is from a 50 a day to a 20 a day creel, and maintaining the 10-inch that was in effect there. This type of regulation falls into a sociological regulation versus a biological regulation. And we have done multiple studies of crappie populations. And basically the change from 50 a day to 20 a day will not have a biological impact on that population, but it's a sociological impact that our anglers want to see.
Sociological impact, meaning that fishermen want the creel limit lowered?
Yes.
Find that hard to believe. Thank you,
There's a
Madam Chair.
trend all across fishing that fishing is becoming less about what you can take home and eat and more about the actual act of fishing, being outside, pursuing fish, catching fish is becoming more important to folks than catching fish, taking them home and eating them.
Frying up a mess of crappie is important too. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, that doesn't really make any sense. It really doesn't. So we're doing everything by sociological, and then if I talk to Representative Wynn and she says that she doesn't want to buy cherries in bulk. She only wants 10 cherries every time she goes to the store. And you decide, well, that's a good idea. We're sociologically, we only need 5 cherries in each bag.
Could I just pause for 1 second? I have a question for him I want to ask.
Sure.
Okay, so just, Madam Chair, just clarifying some details there, because I know we do fall netting every year at all of our impoundments across the state. And that was incorporated into the analysis. So they collect fish throughout the fall and net them and count them, and they do population estimates. That's where he says, I think he was talking about how it wouldn't have a biological impact. So hard scientific data is also, it's not just a pure question of what would you like to see. There's also backed up by scientific data that our fisheries biologists are collecting on an annual basis.
So I'm going to let some other people on the committee ask questions, but my biggest question is why? I mean, I don't get it. What is the biological thing? Biological reason. What is the biological reason for this? I'm gonna let you think about that.
Okay.
Representative Corbett.
The question I have to start with is, do you know, say the last couple of years where the resident and non-resident fishing permits are on an incline or decline? And if you could get me some numbers later on that.
I apologize, Representative. I don't have that data with me. I can get it to you though, for sure.
Because it seems like we have less and less people fishing. And if you use your, the way you determine how you get your data against how many people who fish, and then you throw in biological information, doesn't really mean anything. You just feel like fishermen don't want, they want less of a limit. If you use that same terminology, why couldn't we do that on deer and every other species in Kansas? Because basically, I think what this says is, whether it's fish or any other critter, there is no true hard number of how many critters there are and how many are taken, and whatever happens, it's just whatever sounds good and feels good, because I don't think anybody knows in any body of water or any piece of farm ground what critters are there. And it's just like deer or anything else. We don't have people hunting them. They're going to keep getting more and more and more, just like on your, not taking your 50 fish. If we don't keep taking the fish out of there, there's some biological problem going to happen on that if they get overpopulated, I would think.
Yeah, I guess to answer your question, I'm not a scientist myself, but from my limited experience here at the agency, I know that we measure each different animal under different methods. I know like deer, you referenced, we have different methods of gathering that data, but I think they have to use representative samples based on whatever area, geographic area they're studying, whatever animal that is.
I understand that, but with Kansas being 97% privately owned, the 3% you may be surveying on, how do you know what's in the rest of the state to hunt or fish? That's my dilemma on that, because I want to get as many people out there fishing and hunting as you can, because it's a good revenue income for the state and the tourism. So, but I hate to see these decisions made by just because either the locals don't want them or somebody at certain lake doesn't like that idea. So, I hear where you're coming from, but if you had to do the math on it, I don't know how you could prove it.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for your passion on this issue. The good representative brings up, many of the committee do bring up excellent points. We've listened to you guys for years talk about restricting turkey season, deer season, all these others, and you say it's always based on the data. And then you come in today and say, oh no, this is sociological that we're gonna base it on, not even numbers. It loses credibility for the department going forward especially. And Madam Chairman, I'm gonna jump subjects on it. My question is actually about the 16-year-olds language that's striked. So is this handled in a different area, or is it they can no longer catch the paddlefish? I mean, what's the objective here? And
No, so-
Madam Chairman, I'm going to say something too. When the overview was given to us, none of this was covered in the overview. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Which I think is an egregious problem that you've caused, and with trust between the legislature and the wildlife and park. So I would pay attention to that. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going back just a little bit, and actually tying into the revenue side of things, because that's kind of where I live. You had mentioned that we purchase trout for people to fish. Are there, well, first off, I'd love to see the numbers as far as the expense of the purchase versus the amount of trout fishing that we attract through revenue, attract revenue from. But are there other non-indigenous, I thought wildlife was, wildlife, the stuff that exists, was a natural resource of the state, not something that we brought in to prop up licensing. So are there other non-indigenous species that we bring into the state just to shoot or snatch out of the lake?
So on trout, my understanding is that's our main, and I can be correct if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that's the one that it's not indigenous to Kansas, but we have a very strong desire for trout anglers in the state. So we do have a special program to bring them into the state, because there is such a strong desire to fish for them. There are other fish that we have to regularly stock because they don't naturally reproduce in our Kansas reservoirs or impoundments. But like we said here with the blue cats, they've been able to maintain a population. So that's why we can loosen the restrictions here and allow people to take more, because they are reproducing and we don't need to restock them on a regular basis.
Which, to my way of thinking, is the way it's supposed to work. Do we have a cost-benefit analysis on buying things in order to then hunt them?
I'm not aware of us importing any animals in particular to hunt them from other states, but
Fish for them.
But fish for them, right? I think the director of our fisheries division can answer that question. I'd be happy to get you that information. There is, with these increasing costs, I know in conversations with him that there's a real concern about the spiraling costs to the trout program and the cost that it has to be passed on to our anglers in order to enjoy that opportunity. Trout in this state, my understanding is the water is so warm and turbid that there isn't a high enough density of oxygen in the water to keep them alive. They require very cold water with high oxygen. In Kansas, we just don't have that. So in order to maintain a trout population that people fish for, they have to We have to bring them in, usually from Missouri, I think is typically where we purchase our trout.
Okay, now this, Madam Chair, this is going to sound a little bit silly, and I get that in advance, but this is what I'm seeing in my head. Have we considered importing rhinoceros for hunting?
I don't think so.
See, it sounds absurd, but that's kind of what I'm hearing on trout as well. We don't have them, but we'll bring them in so that we can then fish for them. I'd love to see the cost benefit on that.
Sure. I'd be happy to have our Director of Fisheries provide you information on that cost benefit, what it costs the agency.
Excellent. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, if I might, please, on the prior question about the language on the age 16, I was not, just to be clear, not attempting to hide the ball at all in the interview, or sorry, in the overview, because that's a simple technical change. It's being moved to a different regulation. So that language of any individual younger than 16 years of age may use an adult paddlefish permit, that will remain law. It will just be in a different regulation. I didn't, because it's a technical change, I didn't see it was worth putting in the overview, but I'm happy to answer any questions about them.
Thank you. Representative Corbett.
Yes, sir. Your agency is somewhat based on fees for running your operation. You get a little tax dollars once in a while, but the more licenses you could sell, the more money you could make for other things you might want to accomplish. And just like this, if you know what a trout cost, and you could triple or quadruple your money by buying licenses and get the word out to fishermen, you could adjust that license a little bit, or it's just not this item, but it's a whole snapshot of things. You've only got so many things to sell. You should try as hard as you can to maximize what you can make on that, to make the department can be more cash friendly. You know what I'm saying? But you turn away about 30 or 40,000 turkey and deer hunters. Now it's ducks and trout, and there's hardly any critter that doesn't seem to have a chance to be in the economic impact of your agency. And I think you need to show us a look that you can tell us that here's what we're spending, here's what we're making, or just something. You know what I'm saying? You are kind of a business, so.
Well, and if I may put in this, they did try last year to get rid of having to do any kind of economic impact statements because they said there's no way to do it. I think you can do that with the trout that you're bringing in. And then you keep trying to get rid of non-residential hunters. I don't understand that either. It seems like as a business, you're wanting the state to lose money. So, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your responses today. And I'm glad we're looking at the economic impact statement and the economics of these changes. As I look at the economic impact statement, and I listened to your statement that you said just a few minutes ago that the commission desires to have trout anglers in the state. However, the proposed regulations would restrict the amount of time that the trout anglers could be here and participating in their activities. And Section 3 in particular of the economic impact statement talks about the extent to which the rule and regulation will enhance or restrict business activities. And the response by the department is there is no expectation that this regulation will either enhance or restrict business activities and growth. And I just don't find that that's kind of the situation when you're restricting in the regulation the trout season by another month and a half. Wouldn't that impact our motels in Section 3C there? It talks about businesses that would be directly affected by the proposed rules and regulations. And the response from the department is local gas station, motels, fishing guides, and state parks would be affected. The effect is anticipated to be neutral, not positive or negative. Well, it's affected, but it's not because it's neutral affected. Just, it doesn't make any sense. And finally, before you answer, Section 3B talks about the economic effect. And the department again has answered no quantifiable economic effect is anticipated. And then the department talks about changes to length and creel limits for sport fish, but doesn't talk about the shortening of the trout season by a month and a half, which, you know, I haven't done an economic impact study, but it seems to me if you're limiting the amount of time people can be here in the state, spending time at motels, needing local gas station services, fishing guides, that would have an impact. So I'm curious by the kind of non-response responses in the EIS.
Yeah, so a number of parts to the answer, Senator, is that, first of all, trout fishing in this state, from my understanding, more also in my personal experience, is that, you know, people go to Colorado to trout fish, or, you know, in Missouri and Southwest Missouri, they travel there to trout fish. Because we import a lot of fish into our impoundments here, my understanding is that trout fishing is not a big draw to out-of-state anglers for this state. Now, as far as the data, on talking to the fisheries, I came on board when this regulation was already in the process, and talking to them about, okay, when I was trying to understand what the economic impact of this regulation could be, is they told me that over the years, they've monitored our license sales in relation to when we change our creel links. And unless there's would be a massive restriction where, say, we shut down pretty much all fishing of a particular species that's very popular, that obviously would have a massive economic impact on fishing in Kansas, both out-of-state and in-state fishing. But the changes are such to this regulation, they're not massive changes, that there was no quantifiable data for us to pull. I guess the statute talks about in determining the economic impact is readily accessible data, which I take to mean data that the agency itself regularly collects on a regular basis. And we just didn't have anything on hand that would indicate a massive change one way or the other on these changes, including a shortening of the trout season.
Thanks for the reply. So you kind of made the decision, I guess, blindly, not based on any data, but you were talking about the sociological, sort of the feelings about it.
Well, I think the gentleman was speaking to that specific, talking about that specific crappie limit, but I'm saying on looking at the economic impact, I looked at what historically we've done and what effects it's had on our license sales, which is typically when we're thinking about our agency, what kind of economic impacts included. I typically look at license sales. If we're raising a fee, obviously I can look at the fee and what effect it would have on the individual paying the fee, and I can come up with a pretty easy number. But in this situation where you're adjusting the length of a fish that can be kept, it's almost impossible on the data that we regularly collect to determine what kind of economic impact that would have on residents and non-residents.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may, just one last question. Again, looking at the economic impact statement, section 4, it asks, does the EIS involve any environmental rules and regulations? And the department answered yes, and the EIS requires, if yes, complete the remainder of section 4. And then to each of the following 4 questions to complete the section, the department doesn't provide any answers, as there are no again, no answers provided. So why the yes?
Yeah, I apologize. I noticed that when I was prepping for this, that was a mistake and that should have been checked. No, this is not an environmental regulation. It's just a creel regulation. So apologies for that. Yeah, that was a mistake as far as I can tell.
Well, it's interesting because someone filled out the form and then they affirmatively answered the yes questions. It wasn't just, oh, I checked the wrong box and I went on, but somebody checked yes and then affirmatively answered 4 follow-up questions.
As I mentioned before, and I'm not trying to throw anybody else under the bus, but this was in the process before I showed up. I started in this job about 9 months ago. That was just a mistake that was made, so it is not an environmental regulation, Senator.
So will you be preparing an amended EIS?
I can submit one, yes, to the Division of Budget, correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any other questions or comments? I know you're new. I want to give you all the chances you can. But particularly one of the bills at the end of this last session was very contentious. And I would really like to see, instead of always working in anger and distrust, that we can come to a point where we think you guys are doing a great job. But right now, that doesn't appear to be true. And I think, to be honest, I think most government agencies forget that they were created to help Kansans. Not to restrict Kansans, not to take things away from them, to allow them freedom and liberty to do what they wanted to do within a safe state. It would make me so happy if every day you guys thought about the fact, every agency thought, we're here because we work for the people of Kansas. We're not here for ourselves, which is what we have to do. We're here to vote for the people of Kansas. And once we start voting our own decisions and we veer off, we tend to cause problems. And I think most agencies have done that. So, all right, so we do have a lot of requests from you, and we'll go over them at the end of the meeting as well. But thank you for being here.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
By the way, is there anyone on WebEx? Pardon me, is there anyone on WebEx that I'm not? No, is any other member on WebEx that we haven't? Okay. Okay, we'll move on to the State Board of Pharmacy. And they're not here?
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, I'm glad. I was looking at WebEx. I couldn't tell if you could hear me yet. So good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Bradford DeYoung, and I'm an attorney with the Kansas Board of Pharmacy. And on behalf of the Board of Pharmacy, I will be offering testimony regarding the board's recent efforts to update the board's rules and regulations. To that end, the board will be amending 2 regulations, adopting 2 new regulations, and revoking 2 regulations. So we really have a kind of a triplet going on here. But I will be addressing them in the following pairs. We will start with 68.710 and 68.710A. Then we will proceed on to 68.21.2 and 21.8. And then finally, we will address the 2 revocations being 68.2032 and 68.2033. Starting with 68.710 and 710A, I think it's important to discuss the background behind 68.710. 710 has been the subject of numerous questions that our board inspectors have fielded about this regulation. And those questions have primarily revolved around the fact that the regulation has some unclear wording, and quite frankly, it's very bulky. And when the board opened that regulation, the board found that in essence, this was 2 separate regulations trying to fit into one. As such, the board has taken the opportunity to carefully separate the regulation into the 2 areas that it governed, and that would be emergency kits and drug distribution systems. So with background out of the way, I want to talk about why the board is amending 68.710 and then creating 710A. 68.710 will only govern e-kits or emergency kits in long-term care facilities. And you can think of a long-term care facility as a nursing home, for example. These e-kits are statutorily created. That's from KSA 65-1648. And in essence, they are small boxes, sometimes actually a tackle box, that contains drugs necessary to handle an emergency situation. These e-kits are kept in the long-term care facility, and they are used to address situations that cannot be foreseen, such as epinephrine for anaphylaxis, anagelics for pain, and glucagon for extremely low blood sugar. These e-kits are then stored at the long-term care facility, but the long-term care facility does not own the e-kit. Rather, ownership will remain with the pharmacy that provides the consulting services to the long-term care facility. And because of that, the regulation requires the pharmacy to audit the drugs in the e-kit after it has been opened, or at least every 6 months if it hasn't been opened during that time. The pharmacy must also ensure that the e-kit has an expiration date that is no later than the earliest expiring drug. And this is all done to ensure that in the event of an emergency situation at that long-term care facility, the patient is not being administered an expired drug. Now, the changes to this regulation, aside from just splitting it into, which I mentioned at the top, primarily revolve around updating language and clarifying the e-kit requirements. The board has been receiving reports of the long-term care facilities using e-kits as a drug cabinet, and inspectors have observed these e-kits being used as de facto pharmacies. And I want to be clear that this is in violation of both regulation and the implementing statute. We are hopeful that the changes to this regulation will bring the additional clarity to ensure that these e-kits are being maintained for patient safety and are only being used in emergency situations without creating unnecessary risk or burden to the pharmacies or the long-term care facilities, or unnecessary risk to patient care. Now, 710, as I mentioned, 710A, excuse me, is the new regulation that was carved out of 710. Reminder, they were two regulations trying to fit into one. And 710A governs drug distribution systems in a facility. And what that means is this regulation applies to the pharmacies that provide drugs to either a crisis intervention center, long-term care facility, like the nursing home, or a psychiatric hospital. If the pharmacy provides drugs to one of those facilities, the pharmacy must ensure a couple things. One, that the drugs and devices dispensed to the residents of the facility are dispensed in a timely manner. Two, that the drugs are dispensed in proper packaging. We don't want any sort of improper packaging that would compromise the drug. And the drugs are filled or refilled pursuant to an original prescription or medication order. The final point is that if these drugs are dispensed and then ultimately returned back to the pharmacy cannot redispense these drugs if the drugs were removed from their packaging. Of course, this is done to ensure that in the event that they were removed from the packaging, the pharmacy can't be sure what happened to that drug. We want to make sure that no adulterated drugs then re-enter the market from a pharmacy. I think it's important to note that for these two regulations, and particularly this one, is that the requirements have not changed substantially from what is currently being required. I think I'm hammering, kind of hitting a dead horse, but the changes just revolve around these two key points. One, moving it into its own regulation. We don't want any confusion, and that's one of the questions that our inspectors were fielding a lot, is because these two regulations almost seem to entangle one another, and it was a very confusing situation. But two, we want to clean up the language. For example, the requirement for a drug to be packaged in a unit dose container was clunky, and it was overly burdensome compared to the new language. Just as a brief statistical point, that one provision has been reduced in word count by a third. It went from 44 to 29. And it's not just, oh, we simplified the language, but we removed little requirements that were there that were just burdensome, that didn't necessarily need to be there without compromising patient safety. Finally, I do need to talk about the economic impact of these regulations. And as the board has looked into these regulations and consulted with stakeholders, the board has found that there will be no economic impact from these regulations. Now, the primary reason the board has determined this is because the regulations do not substantially change the requirements that are already required for pharmacies in Kansas. Once again, beating that dead horse, it is just splitting it so that we're not being confusing. With that, do I have any questions regarding 68.710 and 710A, or would this committee like me to just go ahead and jump right on to 68.21.2 and 21.8?
We have some questions. Representative Sutton, and then the senator will speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to find it again. As I reviewed this earlier, the definition of emergency for the emergency kits, did that only include life-threatening situations? For some reason, that's sticking in my head.
Okay, so let me pull up the regulation real quick on my end so I can triple check what I'm saying so I don't misquote the regulation. But e-kits, which is going to be found starting on page 4, the bottom of page 4 of that regulation as it has been marked up through strike-through text and et cetera, you will see that the e-kits are only to contain drugs that are generally regarded by practitioner as essential to the prompt treatment of sudden and unforeseen changes in the patient's condition that are present in, that present an imminent threat to patient's life or well-being. So to answer your question, I believe you said, does it include imminent threats of life? Yes.
Okay, and actually, the question was, does it only include imminent loss of life?
The board does not actually define what drugs can be kept in the e-kit. So that decision is made by a committee that the pharmacy utilizes, and that pharmacy has to determine that the drugs kept there are for imminent threats to patient life or well-being. If that committee decides that, then the pharmacy and the long-term care facility can utilize those drugs in the e-kit. But that is not a decision the board makes.
Interesting. All right, now, if I could continue, I was just a little concerned by that because it sounded to me like we were only talking about life-saving intervention here, and so obviously I was most concerned about narcotics or something along those lines, and so I looked up the DEA's standards for emergency kits, and they were talking more about, well, theirs was a little vague as well, by the way, but they were talking about also situations that may not be life-threatening but were unplanned. So severe pain or something along these lines would
Yeah.
also fall under e-kits per the DEA. I was just concerned that yours might be a little bit more restrictive.
No, this is something that, and I think that falls within the well-being. However, I will take your feedback to the board so that way the board can discuss this particular feedback, as I think it is always important to note.
All right, mission accomplished. Thanks.
Senator Fauske-Dove.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in regards to the long-term nursing homes,
Mhm.
so has there been any cases where a patient has received the expired dosage of insulin? Do you have a number of who've had to use the kits? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Regarding that question, I do not have any statistics about any time a patient has received a expired drug from an e-kit. That doesn't mean that it hasn't happened or that it has happened. I don't have that information. I can discuss that with our board and with our inspectors to see if we have any statistics regarding that, but I don't, nothing that I'm currently aware of.
So, Madam Chair, so then this would be to hopefully prevent that from happening, your proposed measure. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Just letting him. I do have a question. I don't see any other questions right now. Oh, go ahead. We'll go here. We'll go over to Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I do have a couple of questions. One, and this one is for the revisers, actually. It seems to be that these are substantial changes, not just terminology, but like adding, I'm just wondering, the statute, was there something that changed this year to bring this about? Or I don't see why. It makes me question why the rules, if nothing changed, why they were implemented as they were, or why we are making these substantial changes. Sorry, Jenna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So to my recollection, the authorizing statute, statutes listed in the authority memo have not been changed recently. And additionally, as far as the legal authority goes, you know, whether an agency is allowed to adopt certain changes or not, they do go through the review by the Attorney General's Logic Division Office. And so if there are specific questions regarding their legislative authority, then you could probably contact that division and they'd be happy to answer that for you. And obviously, if it has a stamp, it passed their check for legal authority. And additionally, Jesse's pointing out to me that the implementing statutes looks like they're last changed in 2017.
If I may, Madam Chairman, thank you. That's exactly what I needed to know. So I asked the department why substantial changes were their cases. You're saying that these rules did not follow statute, and now you're changing them so that they do follow statute. I don't know, this just raises a few flags. Would you please address that? And, you know, one of the things that you put in here is that it shall have a written agreement that states what's in the kit. I'm just afraid that some of these long-term care facilities may not be able to execute or react in a manner as needed, and may not be able to get a hold of a technician, certified technician. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay. So Senator Tyson, let me first address the reason for this, and I want to clear up a little bit of confusion. I may have misspoke, or I may not have clarified this exactly. The changes are not, the changes to this regulation are not substantial because the actual changes within the regulation, what is required of the pharmacy, what is required of the long-term care facility, is not changing. A lot of that is clarifying the wording. Now, as to the impetus on why, there are two. One, this is part of the board's review of all regulations within 5 years as dictated by House Bill 2087, I believe, which requires the board and all agencies to review their regulations. So that's the first impetus. We are going through this review process to make sure that if there are regulations that can be revoked or need to be amended, we are doing so. Our second impetus is actually due to the confusion that this regulation caused. And that confusion, as I've mentioned, was primarily based upon the fact that this was two separate regulations trying to hide in one regulation. That was causing confusion to many of our stakeholders, and as I mentioned, has been the source of numerous questions that our board inspectors have received. Regarding whether or not the long-term care facility will be able to get a hold of a certified technician, for example, I want to clarify that the long-term care facility already should have an agreement with the pharmacy providing these consulting services to the long-term care facility. As I previously mentioned, these e-kits are owned by the pharmacy. They are not owned by the long-term care facility. So there is already some variation of an agreement in place. Now, the pharmacy is the one who is responsible for ensuring that these certified technicians or pharmacists are able to come out and do audits. That is the pharmacy's responsibility, not the long-term care facility. So I think that should hopefully address your concerns regarding, is this going to be something that the long-term care facilities are going to struggle to do? I want to be clear, this is on the pharmacy, and the pharmacy already has certified technicians because as defined, and I'll clarify my definition here before I misquote myself again, but a certified technician is, actually a recognized technician is a technician who has passed a certification exam, and that certification exam is already required for pharmacy technicians before they can renew after their first 2-year cycle, essentially.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So why, from 2017 to now, are we just changing the rules and regs now?
I think that has to do with the fact that as we have gone through the process, as the board has gone through the process of reviewing all of the rules and regulations, this regulation was, while a higher priority than other regulations, um, was not necessarily the highest priority regulation in between when I first started with this agency a few years ago and today. Uh, I think that I think it's a simple question of the regulations that were of more important or more dire concerns had to be addressed first before we could address regulations which, like this one, were causing questions and queries, but not necessarily, um, nothing had to be changed so much so that if we didn't change the, I'm struggling to think of a proper terminology to say that the world would be ending, and that's not correct, obviously. It's just a change to reduce the questions that we received because our licensees were confused. So we're revising to eliminate that confusion and to help hopefully improve compliance with the rules and regulations and statutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it speaks for itself. Not a priority. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
If I could point out that we did pass something that said they had to go, there was a 5-year schedule where everyone had to go through their regulations. And when did that start? And so no one had been doing any of it. We had never seen revocations before. So, Representative Corbett.
The question I have is where is the funding coming for the e-kit, and who has to end up paying for it?
Representative Carmichael,
Corbett.
the e-kit.
That was
Oh, sure,
Representative
Corbett. I am so terribly sorry. Representative Corbett, as far as I'm aware, the e-kits are owned entirely by the pharmacy. When the e-kits drugs are administered to a patient of the long-term care facility, it is my understanding that that would then go through normal billings such as insurance, or insurance, however that may take place. But admittedly, that is not something I'm super familiar with because that is outside of the pharmacies, the Board of Pharmacy's purview. We don't control insurance.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions over here? The only other thing I wanted to have you can get back to me with this. I have read and have been told that the expiration date on a lot of medications is really not the true expiration date of those medications. And I'll use Tylenol, by the way, where you don't have to throw it away when it says it expires in 2024. Now, if it's 10 years past expiration, you can assume that you might have to take a couple instead of one to get the same efficacy. If you could figure something out, like what, I mean, it seems like if you're changing it year by year because things have expired, that makes the pharmacy more money. So I would like to know how you all come up with that as well.
I would be happy. I'd be happy to discuss that with the board and the inspectors and get you an answer.
All right, thank you. You can go on with your discussion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, our next two regulations that the board will be addressing is 6821.2 and 6821.8. And these two regulations address or really involve the Kansas Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, which is better known as KTRACS. The KTRACS program is mandated by statute and requires the board to maintain a database that contains information on each dispensed controlled substance and drug of concern sold in the state of Kansas or shipped to an address in Kansas. Each state typically has a very similar program to Kansas's K-Tracks. But in addition, K-Tracks has also been an excellent resource for both prescribers and pharmacists to help curb things like doctor shopping or overprescribing or over-dispensing controlled substances in Kansas. 6821.2 currently requires pharmacies to report to K-Tracks all controlled substances and drugs of concerns dispensed, unless an exemption applies. And the board is amending 6821.2 to add an exemption for pharmacies that dispense to an inmate at a correctional institution. This change was requested by the pharmacies that do currently dispense to inmates at a correctional institution, as the reporting requirement was burdensome. And I understand that this may seem odd because I just talked about how these drugs have to be reported, but the drugs dispensed to a correctional institution are tightly controlled by the correctional institution, and the risk of diversion is incredibly low. Furthermore, the ability to doctor shop or over dispense is practically non-existent. Therefore, this board is implementing this change to help reduce overly burdensome requirements. 6821.8, on the other hand, is a new regulation that will expand the eligibility criteria for who may serve as a delegate to receive access to the K-Tracks database. The board has received requests to expand the definition of delegates to include licensed addiction counselors, licensed clinical addiction counselors, and licensed master's addiction counselors. And the board will be implementing that request through regulation. I do want to make it clear, though, that delegates do not have unfettered access to the system, but instead are authorized by their supervising prescribers who already do have access to the system to then access the K-Tracks database. Regarding the economic impact of these particular regulations, the board has determined that there is no economic impact in either direction, as these regulations do not add any new requirements. Rather, they just expand upon who may serve as a delegate, and they actually reduce requirements because the pharmacies that do dispense to correctional institutions no longer have to report to K-Tracks. Madam Chair, do I have any questions regarding 6821.2 and 21.8?
We do have a question. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With regard to 21-2, it says that K-Tracks doesn't believe the aforementioned dispensers need to report as the risk of diversion and doctor shopping is low, but it also lists drug abuse. And I know for a fact there's widespread drug abuse in prison. How would this and any type of drug in prison is used, virtually anything in prison is used as a item of barter. Everything from cigarettes to paper to pencils to whatever they can get their hands on. So I am concerned about giving an exemption on that particular thing for the fact that it makes it impossible to track what type of drugs, even though it's practically non-existent, any access to drugs at all needs to be tracked for those inmates. And that is a concern of mine, if you could address that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes. So I do want to clarify that when we are talking about K-Tracks, what we are primarily talking about is the legal drug channels. And that is when K-Tracks reports, the pharmacy reports that this particular drug, this particular prescription, or this particular drug of concern was sent to this particular inmate. As far as I'm aware, these drugs in this particular situation, these drugs are administered directly to the inmate. Now, tracking does exist on the pharmacy to providing the drugs to the correctional institution, but I think your query dives more into illicit, which wouldn't have been tracked regardless of K-Tracks, because that happens after the drug has reached its ultimate user, and then that ultimate user then, in an illicit manner, provides that drug to another person for, as you said, trading or bartering or what may have you. So unfortunately, even though, as it currently stands, K-Trax cannot track what happens after the drug is administered to the ultimate user. That's just outside of what K-Trax can do. But I will bring your concern, of course, to the board.
Madam Chair, if I could follow up. Yeah, so I know the illicit drugs are making it in. The illicit drugs are actually could be used as well, depending on, how, say they, even an antibiotic or something that an inmate needs. If they don't take all of them, they could keep them and use them as a barter tool. So that's a concern. I don't know if they're being monitored to make sure when it's dispensed, that the inmate takes that medicine. I don't know that part. I do know that pretty much anything in prison is being used as a tool of barter, and it could be even licit or illicit drugs. So that is my concern. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Senator Francisco. She raised her hand, but she just looked at me. She gave me that look like, let me talk.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the recognition. So I appreciate this change that's being proposed. I do believe it will eliminate some unnecessary reporting, especially because we're talking about no more than a 24-hour supply of a particular drug. I'm wondering if that benefit is mentioned anywhere in the economic impact statement.
I do not believe that it is, I believe it is mentioned, but in passing, and I do believe that is because and let me pull up the economic impact statement first before I speak out of turn, please. And I do believe that is due to many of the questions in the economic impact statement referring to what I will refer to as negative impact on businesses in Kansas. I do believe that there is a one catch-all section that does discuss the very, I hate to say this, but minute positive impact, but it is still positive impact because there's only so many pharmacies that do dispense to correctional institutions. And I am not finding it at this exact moment, but I do believe it is there somewhere.
Oh, it's on, it's section 3 in the 6821-2. It's the last economic, that's the next to last economic. And it does say that the proposed amendments are primarily related to reducing needless reports, but it says it would be economically negligible. I'm still glad it's being done. I do think we need to pay particular attention to the costs in our agencies and especially to the Department of Corrections. Thank you.
All right. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I may be way off base here, but it seems like reducing drug reporting requirements to corrections, that kind of concerns me. And obviously, they have to keep track within the correctional facility pharmacy, as it were. But it just seems to me that it's a decent check in the system for someone else to be keeping an eye on it too. And I'm not saying this is happening, but I'd like to keep it from happening. If, say for example, someone in the pharmacy was complicit in handing out drugs, there wouldn't be anyone checking that. And so I'm a little concerned about reducing reporting requirements. Could you address that?
Yes. I think it's important, maybe if I were to create a hypothetical, for example, we'll have person X. And person X is going to be somebody who is an inmate in one of these correctional institutions. And person X has a condition that requires that person to be to have an active prescription or medication order. Of course, the correctional institution is aware of person X's condition, and they are aware of the prescription or medication order. And the pharmacy that contracts with the correctional institution is also aware. Person X is dispensed, or rather, the pharmacy dispenses or administers that person X's 24-hour supply of drugs. So, I mean, that could take the place in a pill, it could take the place in, I suppose, a shot. I mean, there are many different ways that person X could receive their particular prescription. What's not happening is the pharmacy is not handing person X, or the correctional institution, which is then handing person X, their month-long supply. They're not handing them 60 pills or 120 pills or whatever that number may be to person X for person X to keep within their own cell. And I do apologize if I'm misusing correctional institution terminology. So this individual, person X, doesn't have the ability to doctor shop, for example, because they don't get to choose really their doctor. They don't get to have over prescriptions because the prescriptions are only by one pharmacy. When we talk about overprescribing, what the board is talking about is situations where, for example, person Y, who is not a correctional inmate at a correctional institution, takes their prescription for Oxycontin because they have back pain, and they take their prescription for Oxycontin, and they go to Walgreens on 1 Street, and they say, "I'd like this to be filled." And then that same day, quite frankly, the next moment, they leave that pharmacy and they go to the next pharmacy and they say, "I'd like this filled." And so now they have effectively received twice the amount of prescribed medication that they are supposed to receive. And that's what we're referring to as overprescribing. So that's not a concern for these inmates, which is the reason why the board, when the board heard this request, was willing to implement that particular request. So the risk associated that KTRAX currently does help mitigate is not being addressed by this particular not reporting to KTRAX drugs that are dispensed on a 24-hour basis to these correctional institutions.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So are you aware of any other reporting that a correctional facility does with regard to healthcare and drug use? I'm guessing there would be some other reports on that use, and I'm just asking if you are aware of any.
I am not, especially from the pharmacy side of things. I'm once again not to say that it doesn't happen, but I'm not personally aware of that. I can discuss that with the board and see if there is anything else that the board is aware of, but that may be better suited to the agency that controls correctional institutions.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. I agree. It would probably be a better question for the Department of Corrections. And if we had concerns about their use, I think a better way to handle that would be to ask what reporting they do or what records they keep on pharmaceuticals.
Representative Corbett.
It seems like to me if you're in Kansas, they are keeping track of everything you do, the medicines you take. They're on you pretty steady. But if you go to prison, there's less government regulations. You have a little more freedom. It seems like we all ought to be on the same ship on this.
And your response, sir?
I hear the Senator Corbett's concern. Unfortunately, I don't have any control, or the board doesn't necessarily have control what happens within the correctional institutions. I think that would be potentially better suited for the Department of Corrections.
All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Good Lord. I apologize. Representative Carmichael, I've been skipping.
Now, thank you, Madam Chair. No apology necessary. Actually, my question concerns the second regulation that's a part of this portion of the presentation. That's KAR 6821-8. It looks to me like, as you said, this is a new regulation. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
And I looked at KSA 65-1682, which contains the present definitions of a delegate for purposes of KTRAC recording. And it looks to me like this is the first time the board has taken advantage of its authority to add designees as individuals authorized to access the program database by the board and rules and regulations. Is that what's going on here?
To my knowledge, this is the first time the board is expanding upon who may serve as a delegate. You are correct.
In a couple of places in your materials, it says the board has received requests to allow licensed addiction counselors, licensed clinical addiction counselors, and licensed master's addiction counselors to access the KTRAC's database. Can you first tell me from whom or what organizations these questions have originated, and how many such requests have you received?
I actually do not have that. I can specifically recall an email from our KTRAC's director, our former KTRAC's director, who passed along the information that there was requests. I think that information, those requests, stemmed from KTRAC's, I may misquote this, it was a KTRAC's committee of nature. But I don't have those reports. I can certainly look for those reports and provide them to this committee.
With the chair's leave, I would certainly like to look at that. As the former KTRAC's director no doubt would recall, I have continuing concerns about patient confidentiality. And as we broaden the scope of people with access to KTRAC's records, that it heightens my concerns about somebody looking up my records to see what the medicine was that I got a few weeks ago and why. And if you're interested, it was hydrocodone. It's because I got a tooth gone, if anybody wants to know. But seriously, though, why do addiction counselors need access to KTRACs? Because it looks like the people with specific statutory authorization are prescribers or people who administer medications. Why are we adding a new category of people who neither administer medications nor prescribe controlled substances?
If I may, I believe that request is specifically due to the fact that these are addiction counselors, and this information may help those addiction counselors treat those individuals who may have addictions. So, but I don't have the exact specifics in front of me, so I would have to consult with the board before I provide a more concrete answer. But I believe that was the basis, if my memory serves correctly.
Well, are there any other categories of people who can serve as designees or with statutory authorization to access my personal confidential records at the Dillon's Pharmacy who are not dispensers or providers? Is this the only instance of people who don't prescribe the medicine, don't administer the medicine, getting to go snoop through my pharmacy records?
I believe the only other category of individuals are law enforcement and law enforcement personnel determining a cause of death, and I believe that is through statute. But I would
It,
have
i-
to
it,
look
it
at.
is, it's death investigators. It's a specific subparagraph in the applicable statute, but they have restricted access. They don't get, as I understand it, to just take a look under Carmichael John L. and the last four digits of my social security number to find out anywhere and everywhere I've purchased any type of controlled substance in Kansas, because they have restricted access. But I don't think
And one
this
thing,
access is restricted, is it, sir?
the
Access for
only,
mental health counselors.
the restriction primarily falls within the fact that these individuals must be authorized by a supervising prescriber to then access the KTRACS database. So it's not every licensed addiction counselor or licensed clinical addiction counselor or so on and so forth. It is only those who are specifically authorized by a prescriber to access the KTRACS database.
If I may, Madam Chair, just additional follow-up, then work me through the statutory scheme or the regulatory scheme that restricts this access to only patients of a licensed prescriber who then delegates authority to an addiction counselor, because I didn't see that in this regulation and I don't see it in the statute. So where is the restriction that prevents some people who call themselves addiction counselors, who oftentimes are in recovery themselves, from finding out from Dillon's what medicine John Carmichael has taken for the wart on his right heel, which I don't have one anymore, it fell off 60 years ago.
Representative, I will have to re-dive through this again because I don't have that information immediately at hand, but I'm happy to provide it in our response to the letter that we received from JCAR.
And I will withhold my comments until we discuss our comments. I have a few, but I'll save them.
And of course, Representative, I will bring your concerns to the board's attention.
All right, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to follow up on the representative's questioning, this 6821.8 is a new authorization. Is that right? This regulation is new, or is that not right?
Yeah.
This regulation is a proposed new regulation.
So it seems to me, based on the questions and answers that I was listening to, that this is kind of a policy decision, perhaps for the legislature to be making. I do recall, I think this last session, we had a proposed bill that would allow law enforcement to access the KTRACS records without a warrant. And the policy decision, there was policy discussion. And so just to emphasize the fact that the legislature takes very seriously who has access to these very private health records, and for the board to authorize a whole new category of persons to access the very private medical records without, I'm hearing, restrictions really, other than it's for the prescriber to determine whether this or that licensed addiction counselor or clinical addiction counselor may have access. So just to point out that this seems to me a policy decision and not something to be implemented by regulation. So if you have any comment on that.
The board's comment would primarily revolve around the fact that this was specifically authorized to the Kansas Board of Pharmacy. And if I may direct your attention to KSA 65-1682, and I believe that is subsection C, and then beyond that, 3. The the board is allowed to expand upon the definition of delegates through 65-1682C3. And to quote it exactly, says, delegates mean an individual authorized to access the program's database by the board in rules and regulations. I do want to remind this committee that the board does take security very seriously. And of course, usage of the KTRAC system to just look up somebody on a whim is not, it would be a breach of that. And I do believe that there are statutes and regulations which specifically address that. However, I just don't have that briefed out, if you will, immediately in front of me.
Well, you're talking about maybe someone hacking the system, and that's not what the regulation proposes. Any licensed person in 6821.8 could look up any person's record, right? It wouldn't have to be their patient. It wouldn't have to be a person who's in a facility, or am I wrong? I'm looking for the restrictions that the representative was asking about, and I'm not hearing that you've defined any.
It was not defined in 6821.8. However, I do believe that those restrictions are defined elsewhere in regulations and statute. And like I said, unfortunately, I just don't have that in front of me right now, and it would probably take me several, if not many minutes to just quickly put that together, but I'd be happy to do so in the response.
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Still representative until 1906 tomorrow night. Oh, Friday, actually. Yeah. Never received notification of that. Never received notification of that. But thank you for interrupting me. I appreciate it. Thank you. My question for you is going along with what Representative Carmichael and the Senator was bringing up. Do you have an opine from the Attorney General's office about the constitutionality of unreasonable search and seizure, time, place, manner, restrictions, or anything like that concerning this this new proposal? Because that's some of the things that the legislature puts into action and actually runs through. Does the Board of Pharmacy have anything that they can present to us for that? Because I think it opens you up to a lot of litigation if you have absolutely no restriction and you're putting forth this particular piece of policy.
Regarding your question, has the Attorney General opined in addition to, regarding your particular question, I'm not aware of the Attorney General's office opining upon anything beyond stamping the regulation for its legality and constitutionality within it. I cannot speak more to the Attorney General's office. And Madam Chair, if I may, I believe I was looking through this while listening to questions because I was trying to find this. The question for Senator Warren and Representative Carmichael, I believe, can be addressed in 65-1685, and I believe that is also going to be subsection C. And there it does specify requirements and requirements for individuals to access the KTRAC's database. And of course, I do want to mention that because the Kansas Board of Pharmacy maintains the KTRAC's database, the Kansas Board of Pharmacy also maintains audit trails on who accessed this information and sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Who accessed this information and you know, can they bring it back to a patient, or is this just a looky-loo, if you will? And I believe the penalties then are described in 65-1693. But of course, I'd be happy to expand upon this further in a letter to address this committee's concerns.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments? I do have some comments. I'll save it to the end to make sure. But I would ask that since there's a lot of consternation regarding this new regulation, that you just wait a month or so and limit that these counselors to the patients that they're treating, as well as reporting on. All right. Does that sew up all that you've done so far?
We've got 2 more regulations, but they're revocations, and I promise they'll be very quick.
Okay.
The final 2 regulations that the board is addressing is 68-2032 and 68-2033, and these are revocations. These regulations were adopted in late of 2023 and early in 2024, and they classified clonazepam and flubromazolam as a Schedule I controlled substance on an emergency basis. Both of these substances were actually considered and permanently scheduled by the Kansas Legislature in 2024. And because these regulations were done so on an emergency basis pursuant to board's authority, these regulations have lost their effect under law and are being revoked as a formality. As such, the board has determined that there is no economic impact in either direction in revoking these regulations. With that, I stand ready for questions on 68-2032 and 2033.
Are there any questions on that? In the future, for all revocations, I would like something when we get our packet that you send what the regulation itself did. That what exactly are you revoking? It is right there.
I would be happy to do so in the future.
Thank you.
I recognize that it's when they're revoked, they just sort of disappear, and that can be frustrating.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. All right. Now I think you're off the hot seat. Not completely, but you are, for the time being, you're off the hot seat. So thank you for appearing before us. Then we will move on to the Department of Revenue. Sorry to make you wait so long, but welcome to committee.
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. My name is Taylor Murray. I'm with the Office of Policy and Research at the Department of Revenue. First, I'd like to thank the committee for its time to consider these regulations. So the department proposes revoking 8 regulations, KR 9221, 2A, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 12, and 14, I apologize. These revocations are not going to change the way the Department of Revenue is conducting business, but eliminating them is going to help with the clarity and conciseness of our regulations. So this is basically regulatory cleanup. Just as kind of maybe an overview too, there's a practice, especially if you look back in the 70s, of drafting the regulations almost as kind of a parallel version of the statutes. So that's some of what you will see in some of these regulations. That's something that's really not favored or permitted anymore, and it can lead to problems going forward because you have the statute that's basically laid out as statute, and then you have the regulations which laid out as kind of a shadow version of it. And of course, in those areas where those contradict, the statute prevails, there's really not much purpose in just duplicating statute like that. Just as a brief primer, I know we're running long on time, I'll try to be quick, but the regulations concern what is commonly called use tax, which is a shortening of compensating use tax. That's a companion or complement to the sales tax. Some of you are probably well familiar with this, but just for anybody who's listening who isn't, the use tax was introduced to protect in-state businesses when a state imposes a sales tax. So there's really only one use tax, but there are 2 aspects of it, and they're different enough that the Department of Revenue usually uses different terminology for each one. One aspect it calls consumers compensating use tax. So this is something that happens, it's kind of unexpected for some people, but imagine you're a Kansas business, you go and you purchase machinery in a state where there's no sales tax, such as Montana, and you bring that machinery back to the state and use it in Kansas. A lot of times in that instance, you've essentially incurred a use tax on the use of that equipment, which you then have to pay directly to the state. And the purpose of that, to go back again, is the legislature, when it came up with all this, and pretty much every state that has a sales tax does this, is you don't want to put at a disadvantage the Kansas business that could have sold that machinery to that Kansas customer, if that makes sense. The other aspect of that, usually the department calls that retailers compensating use. It's the same tax, but That's the terminology that we use when the seller has some kind of connection to Kansas that legally requires that seller to collect the tax. So when that happens, it really looks quite a bit to everybody involved like sales tax. And you've actually seen over time as the law has evolved here that those two taxes kind of come closer and closer together. I'm happy to pause for any questions about that, or I can go ahead and run into these specific revocations.
Senator ks.gov.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I serve on the State Use Board, and our goal is to get businesses in Kansas to purchase from other businesses in Kansas. So your explanation there to those listening in, and even a clarification for myself. So you said if an individual purchases from a state that doesn't require that use sales tax, but then they bring that machinery back to Kansas. I missed what you said after that. So they bring it back in order to use that machinery, they're paying another sales tax or not? Clarify, please. Thank you.
That's a great question. It's basically set up, and again, every state, as far as I'm aware, every state that has a sales tax does this. It's set up to level the playing field. So let's say, and the easiest example is I think I use Montana as a state with no sales tax. But imagine a state that has a, just to stick with the state rate, let's say they have a 4% rate. Kansas has a 6.5%. So in those cases, they would pay the 4% to the other state. And then when that, I'll use the equipment again as an example, is brought back to Kansas, and that's the primary use is in Kansas. It's not like they're taking, machinery that they've been using in Montana or in the 4% state and bring it to Kansas. They've gone and acquired that equipment specifically for the purpose of bringing it back and using it to Kansas. In the 4% instance, you have that 2.5% difference. That would be the amount that was due. So essentially, the purpose is to broaden or is to level that playing field for the in-state retailers versus the out-of-state retailers. You don't want to disadvantage the in-state retailers by imposing a sales tax when you have other states that can compete. Now, there still could be, there's still arguments, right, about the rate of sales tax. It doesn't fix everything, but it does attempt to address that specific problem of the residents going out of state and making those purchases.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Not seeing any, then go ahead.
Madam Vice Chair, I will move on to the specific regulations that we're proposing to revoke. So the first four regulations, KAR 9221, 9222A, 9225, and 9226, we believe these should be revoked because the effective portions of these regulations essentially are duplicating existing statute. And in those areas where they don't duplicate the statute, the additional material is either not necessary or is out of date. So for example, if you have a copy of the existing KR 9221, you can see it shows an incorrect 4% tax rate. That reflects just, it has not been updated since the sales tax and use tax rates were 4% for the state. And that is pretty much the explanation for 9221, 9222A, 9225, and 9226. I have attempted to describe what each of these regulations does. I know you guys have a copy, or that you all have a copy as well. As sort of discussed earlier, it is a little difficult to go in and really summarize because what a lot of these regulations are doing is trying to just restate all of the use tax statute in regulatory form. So the next regulation, KAR 9228, this one contains rules for delivery that have basically been eclipsed by the legislative changes associated with the streamlined sales and use tax agreement. And I noticed yesterday that when I described this change, I really lean into the SSUTA. I think that's because when we are thinking of sort of the current way that sales and use tax works, we think of all the legislative changes that came around in 2003 and that time period that were associated with SSUTA. But really, I would say that this also kind of fits the reasoning I gave for the prior regulations too, is that the rules for this are laid out in statute. And we really don't want to have a regulation that's just saying in sort of different wording what the statute already says, especially when we look at the law. that different wording can sometimes pose a problem. So, and even the administration itself could be reading the regulation and, oh no, we need to check the statute because we're looking at the wording of the regulation, but we know there's a statute that covers this. Well, what's the point then of having the regulation when you know you're just gonna have to go to the statute? The next regulation, KAR 9229, this outlines a retailer's application for a certificate of compensating use tax registration. This is not up to date with the current application requirements, and the department has other more up-to-date authority to require this information from applicants. So this, again, it's pretty similar. The only slight difference here is that we could have a regulation, I suppose, that spelled out this information. If you look at the existing regulation, it gets down to, I think the one that stuck out to me when we first reviewed this was it says that you have to mail it in, which is no longer true. You can register online. But we could have that regulation. We looked at our sales tax regulations. We don't have something comparable for sales tax, and it's never been an issue. So to avoid, I suppose, over-regulation in that area, we decided it would make sense just to revoke this rather than to try to amend it. It was something of an outlier there. I have gone through quite a few of these here, and I know pretty quickly, so I would like to pause if anybody has any questions. I'm happy to stand for questions on what we've covered so far.
I think everyone seems like they're following right along, so thank you. Continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The last two regulations, KAR 92-2012 and 92-2014, a lot like the first four, we believe these should be revoked because the effective portions are essentially duplicating the existing statute. And again, where they do not duplicate, the additional material is either not necessary or is out of date. So I would like to say there's a public hearing scheduled for these July 15th at 11 a.m. And anybody that does have comments or have any concerns is free to reach out to me. I'm Taylor Murray. My email address is Taylor, Taylor, .Murray, Murray, at ks.gov. And I'm happy to stand for any other questions on these.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to observe that members of this committee, myself included, oftentimes are critical of agencies as it relates to duplicative regulations, outdated regulations, unnecessary regulations. And I think this might be an example of some of those types of things being fixed. And so to the extent that we've all advocated for that and passed legislation, it looks like, at least in this instance, the Department of Revenue is being responsive to some of those types of concerns. I would also observe, as someone who suffered through a class called federal tax in law school 4 years ago, that the less CFRs, the less KARs that I would have to read, particularly when there was a statute already on point, and then maybe looking at revenue rulings as well. You know, the less of this type of duplication, the easier it would have been for me to get that A. Thank you. Which I never told employers about because I didn't want to do tax.
Would you repeat your email, please?
It's Taylor Murray at ks.gov, so Taylor .Murray at ks.gov.
Is there any other questions? Are there any other questions? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would just like to reiterate Representative the Ranking's comments. Thank you very much for being proactive, and I just appreciate the department and all their work. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you again very much for your time.
All right. Now we're coming to that fun time of committee discussion and recommendations. And also so I'm not neglectful, it's nice to see Kathleen Smith in someplace other than tax committee. So they let you go other places. Does Is there any discussion or comments that anyone would like to have in this? And I think you told me you were for sure having some. So we'll start with Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This may not be in chronological order of the times of the presentations, but as I think I've already expressed, I have concerns about the new regulation being proposed by the Board of Pharmacy, proposed KAR 68-21-8. First, it appears this is the first time that the agency has taken advantage of the authority that the legislature gave them to label people as delegees or delegates and define who are delegates through a KAR, through an administrative regulation. And as I look at the statutory scheme, with the possible exception of representatives of the coroner's office conducting death investigations, the people who've been statutorily authorized are providers, healthcare providers, or people who actually dispense the medication. And addiction counselors, as far as I know, do not have prescriptive authority, and they do not have the authority to dispense medication. And there are some people with those particular types of qualifications who have come from a world where they at one time were involved in drug abuse. And I want to encourage them on their path to recovery. But I am concerned that individual privacy of medical records is imperiled when the board starts to take advantage of this opportunity that we have given them. And I certainly hope that they would consider my comments, perhaps the comments of the committee, and rethink whether they're being too liberal in allowing people who are not directly involved in patient care necessarily, particularly people with whom I have no physician, doctor-patient, or other healthcare provider-patient relationship, unfettered access to the KTRACS database. I am aware that our conferee discussed KSA 65-1685C, which talks about who has access to these records. But as far as I could tell, looking at 65-1685C, it doesn't restrict people like these addiction counselors from unfettered access to the records of folks who aren't even their patients. And I'm concerned about that. I hope the committee shares my concern.
I do. So I would, does anyone else want to speak about that? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. More generic comment, but some of these, like the ranking just pointed out, I think they rise to a higher level than just a comment in a report. And I know the committee used to send letters. I don't know what action the committee would like to take, but I think some of these need to be raised to a higher level of action. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Would you like that to be raised to a letter?
I'll follow whatever direction the chair and vice chair think would be most. And if you all want to proceed that way, that's fine. But I'll tell you, I'm sitting here thinking about contacting the reviser to make a particular change that would be to strike one sentence out of the statute, and that would take care of my concern.
I think I personally would like a letter, but I would like to, with the permission of those who have agreed to it, add that if they feel that addiction counselors are supposed to have some access. Sorry, I'm not talking close enough. All right. I don't usually do that. I'm sorry. I don't know. If in fact they really need our Bossingers KTRACS information because they're trying to treat me, isn't there a way to just give them access through the provider of what KTRACS is? So I think they should pull this whole thing out, this regulation, and redefine what they're doing instead of giving open access to a lot of different people. So that's what I'd like to add to the letter. All right.
Madam Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
I may. You may remember us mentioning policy 33 in the past, which prohibits joint committees are not authorized to speak for the legislature except through reports and recommendations, and shall not direct any communication to any agency of Kansas, sorry, I'm trying to read only the relevant portions, without getting prior approval from the LCC. So this committee could send a letter, but would have to get the okay from the LCC in order to do so.
Well, I think we can try to do that. All right, let's send a strong report.
So, Madam Chairman.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you. I would request that we also get the language from the reviser. This committee go ahead and start that so that we are able to start working on it January next year.
Okay.
It seems like there's always a lot of issues, a lot of work, and when we're in the moment, it has our attention, but we're pulled 1,000 different ways. And so it's just, I'm trying to be more proactive so we don't drop the ball on this.
Okay, it's a good idea.
Could I get clarification on what that request would look like? Is that just striking that subsection C from the statute?
I think that's what he's talking about.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think that's the simple solution, is to strike that one line. But I haven't cross-referenced and looked for other places and collateral impacts that might have, or perhaps other places where the same type of authority might be granted statutorily. And I would rely upon the skill and diligence of our reviser to let us know if there are those types of conflicts or collateral impacts.
Senator Warren.
No, I was going to say, Senator, I'm going to give Representative Wagner a chance to ask his question.
There we go.
Are you
Yes,
there?
yes,
Dora
committee, if you
Sands
could-
here.
If
Are
you can
you
hear me
there?
fine.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, if I was going to send a letter, I would be sending one just to thank Patrick Penn for his service to the legislature and especially to this committee. I think he's been very, very helpful, asked great questions. And since this is his final, I believe, action with the legislature, just wanted to do a special shout out to our colleague, Patrick Penn.
All right, very nice. I think we can all agree to that.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I don't agree to sending letters of commendation to retiring members of the committee or members who are leaving the committee. We've had a number of people who've really provided exemplary service to this committee, Ron Highland being an example. And we didn't send a commendation letter to him. I really don't think this committee needs to do that. If the chair wants to express her thanks, the committee's thanks to the representative, that's great. But I don't think we need to send out letters to people when they leave the committee. Thank you.
All right. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry to interrupt the Representative Wagner's question there. Just for a little bit of clarification, I appreciate that the reviser is going to take a sort of a global look at where in statute we, as a state, have authorized access to the K-Trax records. Is there a particular part of 65-1685 that we were looking to strike? I was just trying to get some clarification on which line in particular you were looking at. I guess that's a question for the ranking member.
Yeah, I was looking in particular at, and I've moved on in my screen here. Let me back up and see, but it is in the in the statute that authorizes the reg, and that's 65-1682, and I think it is sub C if I recall. I'll have to call it up on my computer though, but I see Ms.
I think that's correct.
the reviser can help me out of this so I don't have to look it up.
Thank you, Madam Chair Representative. So in the definition of delegate, it says delegate means that subsection C of 65-1682. And then paragraph 3 says means an individual authorized to access the program database by the board in rules and regulations. So I believe that paragraph 3 is what is proposed to be stricken in the legislation proposed.
And are you talking about 1685 or 1682 or both?
1682, and I'll look into
Right.
if there's.
Yeah, I think 1682 is where the authorization is. 1685 is what can be done with people what people who have access can do with the data. Thank you.
All right. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two, actually. First, regarding the Wildlife and Parks, 115-2514. Just want to document my request for the cost-benefit analysis of trout purchasing for wildlife or pets or whatever we want to call those. And also for the Board of Pharmacy, they've already mentioned this, but in 68-710, like to see that more closely aligned with maybe the DEA or other relevant agencies. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to follow along with the Department of Wildlife and Parks, just to document an updated amended economic impact statement from the department, particularly section 4 regarding the response to any environmental rule and regulation. And just a comment, it seems that the economic impact statement in one response is contemplating answers to two very different regulations. One regulation concerns the restriction of the trout season, and then another one concerns length and creel limits. And it seems to me that the EIS kind of only addressed one of the regulations and not the other, even though they are both in the same regulation number, I suppose. So it's hard as a committee to take a look at, well, what is the true economic impact of the proposal when only one aspect of it is answered. So I'm not sure what the fix is, but you can just kind of tell that the length of the season isn't really addressed in the EIS, but the length and creel limit is more what it's addressed to. So just an observation and a concern. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Corbett.
Just a comment, it says in one instance, they wanted to increase the limit on one critter because someone wanted to, and then they wanted to decrease the limit because someone wanted to.
This to me. This is one where you took a bunch of folders home on the weekend, and that was a direct quote.
Thanks. Thank you. Good job. Yes.
So basically, there is no rhyme or reason for anything. I can't believe if the people out that fish all the time would come and say, we just don't want any fish. And then on the other hand, it's
Gosh,
just,
I could have gotten 50 today, but I can only have 20.
you can do whatever you want, but there's nothing to back any of this up other than somebody wants to.
And I think the word is sociological. Not biological, it's sociological. So, all right, are there, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly changing the topic, but I know that there were some comments of appreciation directed to the Department of Revenue for looking at revocations. And I would like to suggest to the committee and the staff that if there is a proposal for revocations only, that we consider that during the first part of the meeting.
In the agenda, that makes sense. No, having sat in the chairs out there waiting to testify, I've realized they are very uncomfortable. So if you could get it done quickly, I think that's a good idea. And staff, if you would take that to heart. Thank you. Are there any other comments or matters to discuss before the meeting? Did you want to go over anything before we? Representative Penn.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Take on my gum. I wanted to, as you all know, there's some changes that have happened with my particular employment over the past couple of weeks, but I was not informed that I was taken off of this committee, so I apologize for appearing before you guys today. The last communication I received was the packet in the mail and the packet in the email and an appointment time, so there's that. So we'll figure out what exactly happened there. I want to welcome Representative Corbett as my replacement. I know that you to be an honorable and good man. I know you're going to do a fantastic job here because you're joining a great team. Leadership is awesome. Every single one of our compatriots on this joint committee are very smart, very thorough, as you've seen today. And I think that the staff is just impeccable. So you're going to have a great time here. To the committee, I want to thank each one of you for just being there for me. I've learned a lot from you in the short time, it feels like a short time that I've sat on this joint committee. And Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and Mr. Ranking, I really do appreciate your leadership. Taught me a lot about how to engage the sticky points, but also pay attention to details, so we'll carry that forward into the future. And to everyone that's in the listening audience, Representative Wagner, thank you so very much for the shout out. I know you're a good man, and I'll be calling you here soon. With that, I wanted to just thank everyone for everything that they deposited into me as we get ready to move out to DC and do some great work for the American people. Thank you.
Well, good luck. Safe travel. Make us proud. Is there anything else for the? Okay, yes. When are you wanting the next meeting? I mean, do you want me to just pick a date? Let's say December 3rd. How about that? All right, so what would you suggest? No, that's the hearing date. So how long before that do we need to meet? Okay. Let's see. Well, then I would say probably the end of July. Would that be, does anyone have openings at the end of July? Or the week before that? Honestly, the week before that would be better for me, but I'm not the only person here. Okay. The whole week is bad for you? All right, am I hearing from anyone else? We just make the decision and then you're here if you are and not if you're not. The end of July. We're talking about anywhere from the 22nd to the 30th. I just have a conflict on Wednesdays, but at the end of July, I'm pretty free. All right. about July 25th? It's a Friday. It's a Friday at 9 a.m. All right, how about the 22nd? All right. How about, yeah, how about the Friday, August 4th? Let's just try getting out of July. Is that, and that's the day before your birthday? What is it? No, it's Monday, August 4th. All right, somebody give me a day that you aren't going there and I'm not going here. I don't know. No, it works. That's fine. July 28th. You want to do July 28th? Oh, I hope so. Let's do July 28th. Oh, God. When do you get back from CSG? Did we already say August 1st was that? Okay. All right, August 1st at 9 a.m. Well, there you go. August 1st. Nine a.m., right? All right. Well, it is. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and I will now adjourn this meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair.